welcome to Kali Tribune podcast. This is the second part of our podcast, Elvish Braids on Re-enchantment of the World. Now, for the sake of brevity, I won't repeat, even in introduction, what I said in previous podcast, and start my run from the get-go. So, you should listen to part one first. We are talking about article by Mary Harrington on return of the high weirdness into the world. Now I'll start with another quote from Mary's article. It's a bit longish, so bear with me. According to Grush, that's physicist that was giving an expose on UFOs in American Congress, governments have, since 1945, been engaged in a sub rosa technological race to reverse engineer alien technology. In the wake of the media storm this caused, pressure has mounted on US authorities to reveal the truth. What then is going on? Are aliens trying to make contact? If not, why are they creeping into the public consciousness now? I suspect that the truth may be less quote-unquote out there than in here. That is, the phenomena we have for some time called aliens were always real, and what's changing is a shared relationship to reality. By the way, this is typical postmodern notion, and this is where Mary loses my favor, falls out of my favor, so to speak. But I'll continue with a quote. When I suggest, that is, when Mary suggests, the aliens were always real, I don't mean little green men in spaceships. I mean that the world has always been stranger than the dominant Enlightenment-style scientific paradigm allows. The scientists and researchers of the Age of Reason, which began with Francis Bacon, arguably, and reached its high point in the 19th century, imagined the universe as a kind of giant clockwork mechanism. Its inner workings could, they postulated, be made intelligible if dismantled and analyzed. But as it turned out, once you dismantle things to the smallest possible level, it all goes weird. End quote. And weirdness is the main thing in Mary's eyes. But the way she tries to explain this weirdness, indeed, even the very fact of her attempting to explain it away is something where I have to part ways with her. Namely, what Mary wants to say here is that with postmodern age, or better to say, with the dissolution of modernity, which I think she calls liquid modernity, a rather good term, because modernity is something that is associated with in imagination, and by the way, this podcast will be much about imagination, with iron and steel, with industry, but with industry that produces hard artifacts, durable artifacts, that is making world home for its master, that is to say, man. Now, this image should be then transposed to the highly developed image of the, what she say, clockwork mechanism, and mechanism in general, of screws and levers. But now, that is to say, from let's say times of First World War in 20th century, 100 years ago from now, this started to fall apart, but not really to dismantle, but as she rightly say, liquefy. If we are to move the metaphor to our own age, we might say that we are living in liquid metal age, liquid iron age, liquid steel age. Everything is liquefying, but it is still metal. It is still lifeless, and it is going dispersing into nothingness. And she, when she says that when you dismantle things to smallest possible level, she means atoms, because to the Rutherford model of atom, and with quantum physics, this kind of like crumbles into something that you really cannot explain away in the system, and so on and so forth. For some reason, a lot of people saw hope in this, and I think Mary also sees some hope in this. The purpose of this podcast is to demonstrate that there is indeed absolutely no hope in this. Going down this path into weirdness that is hiding, that is dwelling beyond the smallest possible things that, by the way, don't exist at all, because something that is material cannot be elementary but can be divided further. There is nothing good coming from it. What Mary wants to say here anyway is that UFO phenomena is a form of in which people try to make sense of the unknown and unexplainable. Mary is very ambivalent. Does she mean by this unexplainable in the sense that the world itself is unexplainable, so somewhere from our own psyches there pop up such things as ghosts and goblins and UFOs? Ghosts and goblins were before modernity. UFOs are modern. That's the dichotomy she makes. I'm sorry. Well, this is the crux. I don't think so. This is first thing I'll say. So when I say what she calls weirdness, these beings and phenomena that are out of the ordinary have nothing to do with, as she calls it, let me find the real, the quote, our shared relationship to reality. I don't think the relationship to reality has any bearing whatsoever on what the world is and what the world is not. I can agree with Mary that the world is really not something that you can put in the Enlightenment paradigm. In the previous podcast, I'll repeat just that. I tried to show how this paradigm created a metaphysics, systematic metaphysics, which is, in my opinion, best exemplified in Kant's philosophy. It closed consciousness, and very consciousness is the invention of the modernity, the very phenomena of consciousness, in a kind of bubble. And everything that is outside that bubble is unknown. You know that it is, but you don't know what it is. Well, what I want to show now is that is outside of the bubble, and is something that is starting to burst this bubble, and that something is coming from below, because, mind you, it is very important to understand anything that comes from below has a sinister qualification in metaphysical thinking. If you think metaphysically, what is out of this world, by world I mean world that you must experience based on five senses, although it is not solely world of senses, of sensible data. It's a world of intelligible data. And when I say data, I mean originally data means datum, given. World is given. But I presume, and I believe that some of the arguments of the church fathers and philosophers through ages really demonstrate this. There is a giver. There is a cause and there is an origin why the world is such as it is, and man is not capable to think without relating to this origin. If he tries not to relate to it or to him, then the thinker is in fact closing his eyes towards it and trying to isolate the world of transient, finite things, to be something that exists in itself. Strangely enough, Kant, who said we know nothing about thing in itself, understood the world precisely in such way, and this means understanding the world as possibility, on the grounds of possibility, not on the grounds of reality or actuality. This is very important, and I talked about it in other podcasts, so maybe I'll put some links below, or you search for yourself. Clue, Duns Scotus and Thomas Aquinas. The words you should search, the names. Anyway, we move further. What we call weirdness now was not weird until relatively recently. The weirdness Mary thinks about are things like cryptids, strange and impossible animals, things like beings that are non-human but intelligent, and such. In previous ages, and by previous I mean modernity also, in parts of the world like my own country, that was whose modernity was formed by socialism, pushing to Marx to communism, which is different kind of modernity than liberal modernity of the further west. Those things were still present, especially in rural areas. So let's take a dip from philosophy into horror fiction and possibly horror reality. Now, the reason why I named this podcast Elvish Braid comes from beliefs that exist in rural Croatia to this day. That is to say, beliefs in the existence of a vila. Vila is a Slavic word for elf, and in contrast to English imagining of this being, a vila is female. Also, they are, at least in my parts, they are all blonde for some reason, most of them at least. It's because most women here are not blonde haired, and it was ideal of beauty and otherworldliness that they have these golden hairs and so on and so on. They are depicted as stunningly beautiful girls, but mostly with a catch, so to speak. They have donkey hooves, or sometimes goats' hooves, if teller of the story about villas is not well disposed towards them, so he wants to add this diabolic part. Elvish braid is the braid elves create from the horse's mane. So there are a lot of stories, and I heard them as a kid. I heard them live, not only read about them, but I heard them being told about. Was that when horses are let loose in the plains, on pastures and so on, especially on mountains in Dalmatian hinterland and Kamešnica, for instance, some such. It so happens sometimes that the owner finds them in the morning with their manes entangled in the intricate braids. And now in Croatia it's popular. I noticed among younger girls they have these elvish braid hairstyle, which comes probably from. So some traditions are still living in younger people, traditions in the sense of the remembrance of these fairy stories. Anyway, to continue about elvish braids, they cannot be disentangled by human hand, and have to be left to disentangle themselves. The strange thing about this, and I'll just put this as a side note, is that I remember I never saw elvish braid, but I know people who saw it. I knew them as a kid. What is interesting is that most people, I heard the stories about this actually happening at that time in the early 80s, were pretty much ordinary middle-aged people that are not prone to flights of fancy, and indeed didn't believe in anything out or about the ordinary. So that's pretty interesting thing. The other people who used to talk about these stories were, we call them kazivači, people who tell, literary storytellers. And I remember that villages had such guys or women who were the ones who would sit, and everybody would sit around them and they would tell these stories, mostly made up, but it was very, very strange listening, because it's very hard to explain how this comes about. This is not just making up stories. This is something where people even consciously decide to believe in that stories. This was a kind of pastime, and this is the way the myths come about, I think, to some extent, but not to all extent. Now, this is very important to note. And what I just told you is that I expressed my belief that some of these, what we would call paranormal events, are indeed everyday occurrence, or used to be, and indeed that they are a product of imagination. Now, how can this be true at the same time? Well, it can be true at the same time because I don't reduce things to particles. I'll give you an example what I mean. René Guénon, in his book Symbolism of the Cross, writes about that is the crucifixion of Jesus. And he ridicules, in fact, the standpoint that if the crucifixion of Jesus had a symbolism that is also astrological, let's say, or metaphysical, especially these cross, signifying the directions of the world, which is a very important thing, that it cannot be that at the same time the true God-man was crucified. And he said that the inability to understand the tradition, and by extension traditional metaphysics, is inability to think that both can be true at the same time. Indeed, that both should be true, because there is an abundance, not the reduction, in the truth. So that's it, more or less, for explanation. Anyways, Mary thinks about such things, and she, why I said that these, the talks I heard about these things sounded very matter of fact to me, is because she uses this shared reality trope. I don't think anything of this comes from shared reality. I don't think that unexplainable comes from this. And indeed, unexplainable was not the stance you had towards these strange beings. The attitude was when you meet a very cute girl, with a donkey hoof, you make a sign of the cross. In most of those stories, this is very important. Although in Croatia, they're mostly depicted as benevolent. There is a explanation, old folk explanation, that villas are the children of Adam and Eve that they hid from God, because Adam and Eve had, let's say, 50 children, and they were ashamed for having so much children. These were pre-pill days, of course, as well as antediluvial. And God came around and asked them, well, how many children you have? And Adam, who obviously learned nothing from Eden, thought that he could fool God, and told him, we have 25 pieces in all. And God said, well, since you are making things up as usual, then let these other 25 be invisible to most until the end of days. This is how they explain them, because what I want to say and what I'm coming at, that the paradigm that kept weirdness at bay was not Enlightenment paradigm. It was Christianity. Superstition is not the enemy of science. Superstition is enemy of religion. Superstition is belief in false gods. That is to say, transposing the qualities that should be ascribed, albeit in negative fashion because he's perfect, to God, are being ascribed to things, to creatures, most notably to stars. In antiquity, we believe that stars are gods. Also that creeks or grooves are the temples in a way of God, and that beings that are supposedly dwelling there are gods themselves. This is superstition, and this is what church fought. But as you see, for instance, in these beliefs, there are even explanations. These are folks' explanation. You don't find it in Thomas Aquinas about these occurrences. but their explanation in a Christian mold, and this diffuses them. And another very important thing with weirdness, pre-modern weirdness, that existed in modernity, as I said, if modernity wasn't aggressive enough, had a moral quality to it, had a meaning to it. So if you treat Vila with respect, or if you don't let her fool you into something, you come out from the interaction, so to speak, with a smile on her face. Maybe something good will happen, maybe something neutral will happen, but not necessarily something nefarious. Now we come to the meat and potatoes. In postmodern weirdness, you do come to demise and to grief. We're meeting with anything that is outside of this, what Kant would call world of phenomena that is enclosed in our perception of the world, so to speak. And to explain what I mean by this, and why this weirdness is very bad, I'll invoke further imagination, the horror movies, and the way the horror movies change through time. Now, horror movie is, in my opinion, something closest to the folk tale I can imagine in modern times. The reason is that most horror movies, being tales that you have to take with this suspension of disbelief and with a moral message. For instance, slasher horror movies as Halloween end up with the message that innocence pays. I know that any aficionado in John Carpenter's movies will know that Carpenter said that the heroine of that movie, the girl that survives the ordeal with killer, who is in fact the embodiment of evil, was his only virgin in the movie, and people thought that this was intentionally put so high. Carpenter said no, but intentionally or not, this is the paradigm that is seen throughout the slasher movies and most horror movies in general. The prevalent heroine is, of course, a woman. The evil is not defeated by cunning or strength that is ascribed to men, but more with moral qualities of the heroine that is weaker than other protagonists of the movie. It's very often so. Come late 90s, 2000s, this progressively changed, and I'll take as an example film from 2002. Ring. Ring is the remake of the Japanese movie Ringu, which was a huge hit, and one of the rare American remakes of Asian movies that is, in my opinion, better than original. It's quite a different movie. It's on superficially, it's following the plot progression of the first movie, but with some changes. But in fact, it's completely different beast. Namely, a Japanese movie has this traditional, although it is very, let's say, has very hopeless ending. It follows this traditional form of morals, of meaningful moral structure of events in the movie. Namely, it's a movie about a girl with parapsychological powers, the power to project her thoughts, for instance, on photography and so on, that was murdered by her mother, thrown in the well. Mother, or I don't remember in Japanese version, it was her lover maybe. Anyway, and by the way, this girl ends up being intersex. That's very interesting. Probably has a meaning, a deeper meaning for Japanese version, but I'll leave that aside now. And then there is a videotape that is a kind of record of her thoughts. Anybody who sees this videotape will die in a week unless he copies it and gives to somebody else to watch it. So coming into Ring, you cannot escape it. You cannot escape it without harming somebody innocent. But this doesn't diminish the moral of the movie, because the reason why this little ring is created is the justified rage of the enraged spirit, and that spirit that is modeled on Japanese traditions. American version has none of these, that moral form. Namely, in American version, the reason why this girl kills in a gruesome way by simply simply letting people see her face, her ghostly face, there is no real reason. In the movie, she's depicted as the heroine of the movie, played by Naomi Watts, discovers the truth about this girl after she saw the tape and realized that she and her young son will die, and her ex-husband. She uncovers the story and realizes that girl was indeed tortured by experiments, but those were experiments that her father did simply for trying to find a way to survive, because she is killing by just existing. And one interesting thing, Ring, elves are always closely connected to rings, dancing in ring, which we call in Croatian kolo, or having elvish rings when you find in the meadow, when you find the burnt grass in the ring. That's where the villas used to dance. In Ring is a symbolism of in the movie, it's a symbol of the situation and predicament of people who come in contact with the little videotape, and also it is the form of the well in which the girl was thrown and killed. So heroine finds her remains. This is like making you believe that this is the ending of the movie, and proceeds to organize her burial. And throughout the ordeal, she reconnects with her estranged ex-husband, and her small son finally realizes who is his father, and it all ends up on the note that by doing the right thing, by finding the body of the enraged spirit, she's laying it to rest, and as a reward, she's getting her family back. But nothing of a sort happens in the end, because her husband is killed, and she who watched the tape, and she has to copy the tape in order to save herself and save her son, and give this tape to somebody else and screw him over. And that's the ending of the movie. Now, what is important in this movie? The important thing is there is no moral good and evil. There is none of that. There is no meaning. Once the weird invades your life, all you can do is to put yourself back in the cocoon or the bubble that's been burst. This is all you can do, because you have nothing to protect you. You have nothing to protect you because you don't even deserve to be protected. Nothing has a meaning. You are just discovering that this, what Mary called Enlightenment paradigm, is useless before the totality and infinity of the things that exist in this world. And this infinity is an absolute space, as is byline of other horror movie I like, Event Horizon. Infinite space, infinite terror. This is the weirdness Mary is talking about, and this is re-enchantment Mary is talking about. This is re-enchantment coming from below. Now, of course, I'm talking about movies here, but that's because I want to give you a framework that is not abstract and that is relatable to what I mean by when weird things come from under your feet, because these are things that are from below in the metaphysical sense. They are from Acheron, from underground. And they are, in that sense, to be understood as malicious. If not malicious, then sinister in every possible sense. If for nothing else, because they burst your bubble. And to finish this, to end this podcast, by returning to the beginning, this is what I meant when I said that we understand world in categories of reason, according to Kant, because this is the most sophisticated explanation modernity gave of itself, in my opinion. And this explanation this is how this explanation ends up. So the things in themselves here are very sinister things. I said already in Kant, things in themselves are in fact everyday things that we cannot see as they are, but only in our own forms of cognition. And this is the moment where those things in itself start to invade. And one thing also to notice is that Mary talks about LGBTIQ as becoming a criteria for human beings and dissolving sexual duality of humans. LGBTIQ is something, yes, it's something that happens, that is occurring along this path going downwards of modernity. But this is something that has to do with our shared reality, because this is a subjective thing. This is a dissolution of man's certainty about himself and of the logic itself. It's something that we do to ourselves. These things are not so. What we do to ourselves is closing the skies, the access to what is above, the access to the cause and origin, and at the same time the opening the pathway to what is below, which is quite a predicament. So there is nothing good in enchantment of the world. Original de-enchantment of the world was not modernity's doing, it is Christianity's doing, because Enlightenment philosophers, most of them, have no problems with occultism, with fluids, with mesmerism, with spiritism, with such things that in fact came to exist in the modernity. You wouldn't see a movie like Ring in the Middle Ages, I believe. These are things that are not, people used to foolishly think that all these occultists and even pop or less pop occultism that exists now and existed in 19th century and 18th century is a throwback to another age. No, it's a product of modern age. In communism, in late communism, it was so-called bioenergy acupunctura. So with medicine, with Chinese medicine is a regular thing, but it was connected to all kinds of beliefs in socialist countries, because this was ersatz religion, the only form of religion they could come up with in the last days, because they sensed that everything will fall apart. This will protect nobody from nothing. And to conclude then, world is indeed re-enchanting. I believe that Mary is right here, but this is not something to be celebrated. Thank you for your attention. This is Branko Malic of Kali Tribune signing out.